Good evening, everybody. My name's Jane Dacre, and I'd like to welcome you to this podcast, a discussion on how the NHS can better manage sexual assault. I'm joined with a fantastic panel today, but first of all, a few housekeeping statements. So there are going to be two panel talks with time for questions from the audience after each one. One is essentially highlighting what the issues are, and the second series of talks is highlighting some solutions. So we hope to end on a positive note. So please feel free to post comments in the chat, which we'll pick up as questions. Participants can also tweet about the discussion and ask questions using the hashtag #MeTooMedicine. So before we start, we have a video to show you. So I'm just going to ask colleagues back in the office to launch the video for you, and then we'll come on to the panel discussion shortly afterwards.
I was walking through the doctor's office and he sort of stumbled, did like this really weird fake stumble and groped my left breast and just sort of stayed there. They told me that it was bad for doctors' careers to be suspended. It had a massive impact on my mental health. All of it did really, but especially predominantly the way the trust handled it.
So I found that very shocking when I heard it. And in fact, even more shocking are the results of the work done by the BMJ and the Guardian, which reveals shocking levels of sexual assault and harassment, with 35,000 cases of rape, sexual assault, harassment, stalking, and abusive remarks. But the other thing is, as is echoed in that video, that people who have been subjected to this have felt that the trusts have not dealt well with what's happened and that they have been unsupported. So I'm joined today by a panel of colleagues who are going to highlight some of the issues and then some of the solutions. So I'm delighted, first of all, to welcome Adele Waters and Ingrid Torgerson. Ingrid is going to be speaking first, and they were the authors of the BMJ investigation. So Ingrid, over to you.
Good evening. I'll just share my screen. Yes, as you said, earlier this month, the BMJ and the Guardian published the results of a 6-month-long investigation which looked at the level of sexual assault and abuse within the NHS and how it is handled. We sent freedom of information requests to every NHS trust and police force in England, asking them to provide a breakdown of the number of cases of sexual assault and abuse over a 5-year period that they'd recorded as taking place on NHS premises. Even though we knew there was a problem, what we found frankly shocked us. NHS trusts told us that they'd recorded more than 35,000 incidents over the 5-year period between 2017 and 2022. Nearly 60% of these involved patients abusing staff, and that really wasn't something we were expecting. This, remember, was the period of the pandemic when every week the public were out clapping for NHS staff to thank them for their work during the pandemic. Another 20% of incidents in patients abusing other patients, and nearly 3/4 of the incidents recorded by trust happened in mental health settings. I just moved to the police data. The police forces that responded recorded nearly 12,000 alleged sexual crimes, rapes, sexual assaults, and other crimes such as voyeurism as having taken place on NHS premises over the same 5-year period. It included 56 gang rapes and 180 rapes of children, including 4 gang rapes of children. And we were also shown evidence of elderly people being raped in hospital. The numbers here are absolutely horrific. Every single one of these people, incidents, is a person who's suffered abuse, and that's an enormous toll of human suffering. And I'm now going to pass you on to Adele, who is going to talk to you about what we found about how trusts are handling these cases.
Hello? I think you've got to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, is it still there?
I can start talking because I know that we're short of time. So you want to hear about solutions and the experts. But basically, I think the first thing to say is that obviously to echo what Ingrid said, and the 2 other journalists at The Guardian, Anna Bowden and David Batty, who worked on this story. I mean, we're all expecting to see this as an important story, but we were really shocked at the figures that we saw and the extent of the problem that they revealed. But what was really interesting also was that various experts, and some of them are here today on the panel, said to us that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there are, for various reasons, there's a lot of underreporting of this issue. So we know that there is a reluctance on the part of staff to report that they have been victims for various reasons, but one of them being that they won't be believed, which is a common thing that people told us. And also, of course, that they are worried that it could affect their career. And likewise, patients are concerned about their prospect of the impact on their care if they also report. So lots of reasons. And a significant one added to that is that the fact is that the NHS doesn't really have a sort of systematic way of recording these crimes, which is what they are. And so there's no sort of central pulling in of the data. So it's what we found is important, but we haven't got anywhere near the real true extent of the problem in terms of the figures. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and what experts have told us is that there really needs to be that systematic thinking, and I'm sure some people will go on to emphasize that point. And I suppose the key thing that that has already been mentioned by Jodie in the introduction, but less than 1 in 10 trusts have a sexual safety policy in place. So that would be a policy, well, lots of trusts have elements of safeguarding and various other elements to disciplinary policies and other sort of safety policies in place. They don't have a comprehensive policy to cover incidents, should they occur, what to do, how to handle them, and also how to prevent them happening in the first place. So that's the sort of call by various experts also and medical bodies and campaigners. They'd like to see a trust have a comprehensive policy in place. And so hence we are seeing people now call for an independent inquiry on the back of this report. And I think I'll leave it there because you need to hear from other people, but thank you for your time.
So thank you very much, Adele. If you have questions for Adele or for Ingrid, please put them in the chat and we will pick them up a bit later on. So I'm going to move on now to a presentation by Becky Cox and Chelsea Hewitt, who are doctors and campaigners from the organisation Surviving in Scrubs. So Becky and Chelsea, over to you.
Hi, I'll just quickly share our slides. So hi, my name is Chelsea Hewitt. I'm one of the co-founders of Surviving in Scrubs, and my colleague Becky Cox will introduce herself in a moment. Clinically, my background is that I'm an emergency medicine registrar working up in the Merseyside region. I personally have quite a lot of interest in sexism and sexual misconduct within the NHS workforce, and I initially started doing some work with the BMA in 2018, 2019, which came out to be the Sexism in Medicine survey. That found at that point that 91% of female doctors had experienced sexism within the workplace within that 2-year period. 31 had experienced unwanted physical conduct, and 56% had experienced unwanted verbal conduct. Off the back of that survey, Becky got into contact with me, and this is where Surviving in Scrubs has come from. So Becky and I both have personal lived experiences of working in healthcare and being victims of sexism, misogyny, and sexual assault, unfortunately. And we had, we knew that there were numbers out there. We had the figures. That survey did a really good job at providing evidence, but there wasn't the stories, there wasn't that power behind it that real testimonies give to this subject. And that's where our campaigns come from. At its core, it's a website, survivingscrubs.co.uk, where anyone in healthcare, so this isn't just a doctor problem, this is an anyone who works in healthcare problem, can submit their anonymous testimony, stories, experiences of these damaging behaviours, basically. So we launched near enough a year ago, actually. And since then, we now have over 160 stories on there, which range from sexism all the way up to sexual assault and, unfortunately, rape as well. Here are some of those stories. So when I expressed an interest in applying for surgical training, a consultant sat me down and showed me a graph of the number of eggs decreasing as I get older and going through training to put me off. It's a sad reality that I can't write about my experiences with inappropriate behaviours, harassment, sexual behaviours, or even physical assault of a sexual nature in this case, from patients, because where would I start? A patient threatened to follow me to the car and rape me, then kill my family. When I raised this to a female senior, she said, "Oh, he's drunk, just ignore him, you're overreacting." My male consultant said it wasn't worth raising a Datex about, and the patient was well known for his difficult behaviour. I had nightmares for weeks. Scrubbed into theatre as a medical student with an all-male surgical team, the senior male consultant just stands next to me, not scrubbed in, watching the operation with his hand on my waist. Some of these really still send shivers down my spine. I've read them multiple times, but you can see that power that we have from this collective narrative. So I'm just going to hand over to Becky now, who's going to talk about a bit of what we've done with our website.
Okay,
I'll
hi.
for you.
Thank you. Can you move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm Becky, I'm one of the other co-founders of the campaign, and I'm a GP who works in gynecology. So this slide just shows the sheer number of organisations that we're working with at the moment. So following on from the stories that we've got on our website, which are now more than 150, we've been reaching out to organisations, we've had organisations reaching out to us, and we're essentially continuing to try to raise awareness about this issue across healthcare and to try to get buy-in from as many organisations as we can. Can you do next slide, please?
Yeah.
And so in terms of what we want from these organisations, we've got quite a few asks, and that's because this is such an endemic, wide-scale problem. So we want there to be education, to be training. We want healthcare staff to be informed about this and to know what are acceptable behaviours in the workplace. We need to see continued research in this area, not only looking at what this data is, as it was mentioned previously, the data is not complete. We don't know the full picture of what's happening, but also to get evidence-based interventions to tackle this problem. We are also calling for an independent inquiry to investigate this issue on a national scale. And obviously, support for survivors needs to improve. We see so many times the failings of trusts, of the healthcare regulators. When people try to report, they just don't get anywhere. And if anything, they get re-traumatized. We need to see our trusts reviewing what practice and policy they have in place, if they have any policy in the first place, and looking at how they can improve those systems. We also need to see an independent, anonymous reporting system that ideally is centralised, so that people do not have to report to a friend or potentially to the person who perpetrated this behaviour. And we also need to see reform from our healthcare regulators to ensure that when cases are reported, they are investigated appropriately and correct action is taken to ensure justice. Finally, we need to see culture change, and this is a huge undertaking across the whole of the NHS, along with our medical royal colleges, regulators, and many other bodies. And then finally, so just a quick plea, we have a crowdfunder running at the moment for our campaign. None of our work is funded, and if you feel inspired by any of this, click on the QR code or scan it and head to our crowdfunder. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. I will now hand over to Simon Fleming, who's also been doing work in this area. Simon.
Thank you very much. To put it in context, the elephant in the room is that I'm a straight, white, rugby-playing orthopedic surgeon male. And to put it in context about why I'm here and what I've done, it was in early 2021 now, so quite some time ago, I was approached by the Royal College of Surgeons and asked to write an article about rape and sexual assault in surgery. Their ask was that they felt I was the only person talking about it and the only person willing to write it. I declined. I felt that my voice wasn't the voice that needed to be amplified or heard here. But the other reason they asked me was because of the advocacy work I've been involved in for nearly a decade now. I regularly get contacted through social media and email by people who have experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault and rape. And often that's because they're looking for support or advice. And sometimes it's just because they want to share their story. And I said, look, I'm not willing to write this without a co-author. So I reached out to, 50 or so women who I knew had experienced these behaviors. And I asked them if they would co-author the article with me. And they all declined. And they declined for the reasons you might expect. They didn't want to relive their trauma. They didn't feel that it would make a difference, and they felt that it would in some way negatively impact their careers. Some who had raised concerns previously said, look, not only do I not want to be involved for all those reasons, but also I've already been silenced. I've already been slut shamed. I don't need it anymore. I was then given the option of having an anonymous co-author. So I reached out to those women again, and even then, with the protection of anonymity, the fear of repercussions of the hierarchy and patriarchy and power systems at play meant that they didn't feel safe to author the paper with me. It was then that I reached out to Becky Fisher, my co-author and someone I've known for many years, who agreed to co-author this paper. It was published August 31st, I think, 2021. And I was not shocked, but many were, by the number of people who came out of the woodwork in social media in particular to say, this resonates with me. This has happened to me too. I have been sexually assaulted at work. I have been raped at work. More and more stories coming out from inappropriate jokes and touching up to, as we've heard before, sexual assault and rape. And our paper fundamentally defined what these behaviors are and highlighted the best evidence we have currently, which is approximately a 1 to 2% rate of staff-on-staff rape, anywhere from 10 to 20% of staff-on-staff sexual assault, and up to 60 or 70% of sexual harassment. This work was highlighted in the media. Government Sajid Javid involved NHS England, and just as often happens with this, the work started to be silenced and sidelined because these are uncomfortable and fundamentally grim truths about what is happening in our workplace. A very brave woman by the name of Philippa Jackson shared her story openly, again on social media, about how she was assaulted silenced, not supported, struggled to report. And so the work kind of reignited and it restarted some pretty uncomfortable conversations about not just what's going on, but the role of advocacy and the role of allies in this space. This is happening in all of our workplaces every day, in your trust, in your GP surgery. And the bit that I guess people find uncomfortable is not just that these things are happening now, but what you permit, you promote. And so if these things are happening in your workplace and you walk past them, you don't challenge them, you're not involved in some of this stuff Becky and Chelsea would talk about, about real culture change and making workplace safer, then there is a real risk that these behaviors will continue and that some of the people who do these things will just get better at hiding them.
Thank you, Simon. So now we've got some time for questions if people want to put questions in the chat. But can I just kick off by asking all of the panel, and please just shout out if you have the answer. Why now? Has this always happened? Are we just less tolerant, or is it getting worse? Does anyone want to answer me on that? Okay, I've got Simon and Hina. So Hina, do you want to start, because you haven't spoken yet, and then I'm going to hand over to Simon.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Hina Bellitz, and being a lawyer in this field, in the field of sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, for over 20 years, it is something that I have seen shift over time. Not only have we had a tendency for it to be totally ignored decades ago, but since the Me Too movement, there has been a shift, a greater willingness for people to start speaking up. But I do agree that doesn't explain entirely why it is happening just now. But I have noticed a big change in people, good organizations, good employers wanting to actively tackle this with a culture change and with training and looking at all of the matrix of issues that could result in a change. So that's my experience, that it has been a slow morphing resulting from a various big selection or different set of issues over time, starting I think with the Me Too movement.
So can I just follow up on that? Is this an NHS problem, or is this something that happens everywhere? Are we worse in the NHS?
Well, I've done cases over the years for NHS and across all industry sectors. And I would say it is not just an NHS problem at all. In fact, there are certain industries, obviously, evidently the entertainment industry, quite often financial services, but definitely NHS as well, where these sorts of things tend to happen more. And I think that often it is a very big sense of disparity in power, I think, that can lead to it being more likely. But absolutely, it isn't something that's exclusively a problem within the NHS. It's across the board.
Thank you very much. Simon, you also wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think some of the previous points kind of hit the nail on the head there. Part of it is, the NHS is not broken. The NHS was built this way. The NHS, which is a glorious organization that I love, was set up by straight white men to further the careers of other straight white men, because that was the nature of healthcare at the time. It never really envisaged women, people of color, the LGBTQ community having voices, having a role, having power. And certainly within rape culture, who is heard and who is not heard maintains the status quo. And so I think as we, many of the people on this call, including yourself, have worked to diversify the workforce, so many of those people who previously did not have a voice and were not listened to and were easily silenced are being heard. One of the things I get called a lot is kind of woke or what have you. And one of my favorite quotes from a friend of mine is, the advantage of being a snowflake is that with enough snowflakes, you get an avalanche. And that's what we're starting to see, is more and more communities who previously were very easily silenced by really quite vertical power differentials suddenly being able to go, these things have been going on since the beginning, but we won't stand for them anymore.
Yeah, really interesting. Do you know, I'm old enough to have had it
happen even to me, and I just thought it was normal, and you had to show your mettle by dealing with it and not making a fuss. There's a question in the chat here from somebody who says, I've been subjected to a situation where I was treated less favourably than a male colleague in a very similar setting in medical school. In legal terms, how would that be described? And does the data look at females who perpetrate this bad behaviour? Any comments or questions on that? Hina.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on that because the phrase "less favourable" is a legal phrase, and it is in the legislation. But anyone who is treated less favourably because of a disparity in any of the protected traits, and that could be sex, race, disability, sexual orientation, religion, belief, age, but any of those traits, it does give rise to a potential claim for example, sexual harassment or sexual discrimination or whatever other trait it is, discrimination. So yes, there is protection in that field for that reason.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that clarification. Now, I think this needs to be the last question before we move on, but there's a question here about the regulator. So what is the role of the regulator in dealing with these things? The question in the chat is about a case that was taken to the police, turned down by the CPS. The woman doesn't want to meet the perpetrator, but wanted to approach the GMC. What is the panel's experience of how the General Medical Council deals with these issues? Becky, and then Simon. Thank you, Becky.
Just to say, the person who wrote that story, I've been there too. I know exactly what that's like. And raising things with the GMC is tricky. It's really hard when you're a victim because you end up being the one running around doing the admin, coordinating a response from the trust, reporting it to them, reporting it to the police, reporting it through to the GMC. Unfortunately, many of the stories that we have that come through to us have said about the difficulties we have when raising it with the GMC. Unfortunately, we know a lot of cases get dropped at triage when they're first reported without ever being investigated. And even then, when they do go on to investigation, the chance of it getting through to tribunal is very, very low, less than 10% of that happening. And so that sense of justice that a victim would want doesn't often happen. It's quite an adversarial process. It's something that's very, very challenging to go through. And unfortunately, it's something that a lot of people don't really talk about. So you often feel quite isolated when you're dealing with these kinds of things. From us as an organisation, we strongly believe that there are many improvements that the GMC could make to this process, that they could make it much better with much more support for the person who raises the concern, but also there are changes that can be made to support people going through that process and the way that decisions are made.
Thank you, Becky. There's another question here about whether sexual assault should be investigated internally, or should employers be encouraged to outsource to an independent party? Does anybody have a view on that? Hina?
Yes, that is a bit of a legal question in many ways. And certainly without a doubt that most of these sorts of incidents will be investigated internally first and foremost. But in any case which is particularly serious or concerning, or where there isn't anyone senior enough or appropriately independent enough to investigate, then we will always recommend getting an internal independent investigator to look into it, much like the Philip Schofield situation, where they've gone quite far down that road by using a KC.
Thank you. There are more questions coming in through the chat, but I'm going to hold some of them there because I don't want us to descend into a spiral of despair here. I'd like to move on now to asking the panel to talk about perhaps some of the solutions. So the first presentation is Hina again. So Hina is a senior employment lawyer. And so she's going to tell us what we can start to do about this.
Actually, we don't need the slide right now, if that's okay. If we could cancel the slide. Sorry. So if I just commence my couple of minutes, First of all, I just wanted to say that a lot of people who've been in the working world for over 20 years probably will have seen acts of sexual harassment and worse, just by virtue of the fact that attitudes have changed, and that's something I have definitely second in terms of what Jane mentioned earlier. But there's a couple of things I want to say. First, it's really shocking and horrendous. If you knew all of the sorts of cases that I've had to deal with, there can be a tremendous disappointment about the fact that most people that bring claims or raise issues, because of course not everything becomes a claim, they will end up either deciding not to do anything or otherwise deciding to settle. I suppose in many ways you could consider it, of the thousands and thousands of sexual and other kinds of harassment and discrimination I've seen over more than 20 years, you tend to have a category of those that just walk away, they ignore it. Even when they've consulted with a lawyer, you'll get those that have it resolved in a way that may be moving, leaving, going to a different department, and then you'll get a certain group that will settle, and it will be a financial settlement under what's known as a settlement agreement. It's confidential, it never sees the light of day as far as anyone else out there is concerned, and it's effectively swept under a rug. And that is a simple fact. Now, the point I wanted to make, and I think one of the reasons why we may have such a big problem on our hands, is because the very resolution that mostly happens, which is a settlement of some sort, or people deciding not to raise it, especially a settlement, tends to mean that we don't have clear visibility of the problem. And so it actually ends up being, the resolution ends up being part of the problem. The matter disappears, it goes away. And so there is no proper accountability. There's no proper way in which we can address the corrosive, damaged environment that these people have been through. And there are some organizations and environments that are classically well known to have a very corrosive and unhealthy atmosphere. Now, I'm a great champion of obviously addressing the visibility of these sorts of settlements and claims, and there is movement in this area, which is really encouraging, whereby people are beginning to see that even if a matter is settled, it shouldn't therefore be subject to such confidentiality that no one ever knows that this many incidents happened, or this sort of problem exists. So I'm a great champion of the idea of proactively looking at culture change and addressing the problems. Now, I think there's probably three key things that we need to look at. Policy has already been mentioned, and policy is really important, but it is completely useless if that policy is not properly, not only communicated, but also understood and worked through. So in other words, policies that are brilliantly drafted must also be accompanied with very effective training. I have seen a sea change in the level of training that I do. At this point in time, I have now had, for example, the last program that I'm still in the middle of doing is some 50 to 100 courses for an organization. Actually, this one isn't NHS, that is recognized as a result of an incident by a senior individual, how at risk they are and how their environment is not properly managed. So I think I would say to everyone, all participants here, to look carefully at the importance of not only policies, but making sure that training is put into place so that ultimately we can move towards a culture change. And I think that's the key. It's not just a case of knowing what the problem is, but actively looking to address how to resolve it. And that is definitely one key way, alongside some of the other excellent work that the panelists here are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we move on then straight on to Tamsin Humming, who is the project lead for the Working Party on Sexual Misconduct in Surgery. So again, more potential solutions. Thank you very much, Tamsin.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to BMJ for this article. You know, the work that we've been doing on the Working Party in Sexual Misconduct is one small section of some of the work that was reported in that investigation that we're looking on, particularly at what Simon was talking about, which is people working in the NHS, as Chelsea says, not just doctors, but everyone working in the NHS, but also in healthcare in general, who may be subjected to sexual misconduct. We had a meeting that Jane, in fact, some of the Surviving in Scrubs and Simon were present at with the GMC to present the results of a survey that we've conducted that is going to be published shortly. And in this meeting, we wanted to make it as collaborative as possible. It seems that sort of turning around and that it would be better to work with the GMC as well as the Royal Colleges and other groups to try and overall come up with solutions rather than any one of us attacking one part. We all want the same thing, which is effective ways to deal with sexual misconduct that's happening in hospitals. And I think it's what Hina's saying is very important. It's really hard to bring about culture change, and that's what we're trying to do within the NHS. And rather than be overwhelmed at the size of the job, I think we have to structure it. So thinking about the small things that can be done by everyone, responding, as Simon said, when these things are happening in front of you, so and bystander training being available, which is also mentioned in the BMJ report. Education becoming mandatory. We have mandatory training in hospitals about fire safety, but there's nothing about how to respond when you yourself are targeted or when you're a bystander to what now turns out to be so highly prevalent. And how do you respond if it happens to you from a patient? You know, there's a real conflict with our duty of care that people feel, and that's often why they don't respond and they don't report. We're looking at trying to find better ways of reporting within trusts, particularly that can be taken where people are taken seriously and believed. That's the first thing. And secondarily, that you could report anonymously, and that there is some way of gathering those anonymous reports with potentially, this was one of the things discussed about at the meeting, that we could end up with a national body that could go into trusts and investigate when a number of anonymous reports have been coming out of those trusts. So that's one option. There are sort of various levels, basically. So there are these small individual actions that can be brought about and could be brought about fairly quickly. One thing that, you know, a lot of the perpetrators are medical, and there is a medical system run by the GMC called appraisal, which happens every year and builds up to every 5 years. You get revalidated. So in that appraisal, you get asked, you have to do a 360 around your colleagues and ask what they think about your timekeeping, what they think about whether you're confidential. So within that, it could be asked, is everyone happy that you act with complete probity in the field of sexual conduct and sexual safety? Because anything that comes up, any investigation into you should be discussed at appraisal, and all of this should be known to the trust board. I went to speak to my own CEO at the hospital where I work, and this is never mentioned. Other safety incidents get reported at trust board level, but this doesn't. So there are lots of things we can do, as well as having sexual safety policies within trusts that could start to change the atmosphere, so that when people do report, they are not disbelieved and silenced, which is what everyone in the first half of this webinar has been talking about. And then, as well as these organisation and individual actions, what we need is societal actions. And for this reason, when we write our report of the meeting at the GMC, we're going to take this to some of the MPs who are interested, who we've been in contact with, along with the support of lots of people on this call, and try and start making decisions at NHS England and even across the whole of the UK level that will hopefully give a bit more of a framework In the end, the GMC, in particular, the way the GMC deals with reports and the other regulators needs to be looked at. And Becky Cox has certainly done a lot of work on this as well. And we believe that the GMC do need to look at their own medical tribunal process, but also how they deal with reports so that this is taken more seriously when perpetrators are reported. At the moment, we know that a lot of these reports are just dismissed, and then there is just no recourse. There's no consequences for perpetrators, and there's no point having a good reporting system if at the end of it nothing happens.
Thank you, Tamsin. Can I now move on to our last presentation, and then we're going to open up for questions. So please put your questions in the chat if you would like to ask anything or comments. So our last presentation is Emma Furlong, Independent Sexual Violence Advisor at East London Foundation NHS Trust. Emma. I think you're muted, Emma. Oh, now you're not. Okay, great. Thank you.
Right. Sorry. Bear with me, and I'm very sorry for. Right. So, welcome and thank you for inviting me to come and talk on this panel. My name is Emma Furlong. I'm a sexual safety lead in the Forensic Directorate at East London Foundation Trust, and more importantly, I'm an independent sexual violence advisor. So I work at East London Foundation Trust, which is a huge trust and covers East London boroughs, excuse me, as well as Bedfordshire and Luton. I'm the sexual safety lead in the John Howard Centre, which is a mental health inpatient forensic medium secure hospital for adults, predominantly adult males. I'm also the independent sexual violence advisor for the trust, and I'm point of contact when serious sexual violence happens within the trust. Simply, my mandate is to support patients and staff who have experienced sexual violence in either forensic or mental health inpatient services, and I'm at the core of developing strategy and support with teams and patients around sexual safety. So our challenge, and I'm really sorry I missed the first part of this webinar, but in East London Foundation Trust back in 2016, sexual violence was never spoken about, it was never mentioned, and if someone dared to talk about it, then it would just get swept under the carpet. So it's everything that I'm hearing now in general hospital settings. So anecdotally, we knew there was sexually inappropriate behaviours happening within all groups within our inpatient services, but we had no hard evidence, and that evidence being data. So the way that we found out what was going on was by asking our staff to complete a series of anonymous surveys, which enabled them to basically let rip with what was going on with themselves. We amalgamated all of the surveys, and then the scale of the problem, which was enormous, dawned on us. And it was something that we just couldn't leave. So trying to save time, we went to the internet to see what was out there to support us to do this work. There was absolutely nothing, because no one was tackling this issue within mental health inpatient. So we grabbed the bull by the horns, and we just started to tackle it. And this is when our sexual safety journey started, really. So what we did, we trained an independent sexual violence advisor. It's a relatively new role that was developed by the Ministry of Justice and the government to support people who experience serious sexual violence post-incident right through the criminal justice system to outcome. We bring a very specific skill set and knowledge and experience with us to this work. In East London Foundation Trust, we use QI methodology a huge amount because the issues we face around sexual safety are so complex and multi-layered. What we do in our service and beyond other directorates is to talk about sexual violence as much as possible. And this is within all factions of our inpatient services. We've had a bit of a rebrand. We call it sexual safety now to make it a bit more palatable. We create safe spaces for people to talk about their experiences, staff and patients, albeit separately. We collect and analyse data. We do this religiously all the time because that data is gold for us. It tells us what's going on. And we train sexual safety bodies to offer support right throughout our directorate and beyond. We have about 30 in the Forensic Directorate and 50 in other directorates within ELF. We've been very lucky, we've worked really hard and we've had a lot of successes. But one in particular that was really satisfying was that three of our wards collaborated to support patients to enable patients to satisfy their sexual needs safely. And the environment that we work in and our patients live in is very restrictive and restricted. We did this with collaborating with our patients on every step of the way of this pilot. And it was a brilliantly successful pilot that has now become embedded practice in the forensic service. And some of the outcomes for our patients were an individualised My Sexual Safety Plan, access to soft porn magazines, which they're entitled to do so, privacy sounds outside the bedroom so that we wouldn't interrupt them when they were enjoying the magazines, the development of sex education sessions, as well as love, sex and intimacy groups. And what was really interesting, and this has been a key theme ever since we piloted this work, is that we've had a huge decrease in sexual safety incidents. And so it's become, as I say, embedded practice to talk to our patients about sexual safety and what their sexual needs are. So the future for us in ELF and hopefully other foundation trusts in London and potentially with yourselves, because we're all up for some joint working. Train more ISFAs because we're invaluable, but I know I'm biased. Train more sexual safety bodies to offer support because they're the backbone of any kind of sexual safety work. To continue to embed this work across the trust and outside of our own trust. To develop local and trust-wide sexual safety strategy and policy, which is key. And also then have the means and the culture and everything to back this up so that it's a successful rollout. To collaborate with our patients on every step of the way when it comes to sexual safety support, to design a service for them, with them. And then I suppose a plea really is to develop a nationwide sexual safety network that crosses over between mental health and general hospital staff so that we can peer support one another. We can offer advice, guidance, because personally, me and my team, we hold a huge amount of advice, skills and knowledge that we're very willing to share. And we want to continue to mandate this work that's given to us by the CQC and NHS England. The legacy, it's really simple, is to ensure that everyone who works and lives in our service has access to sexual safety support. And that's it. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. So we've now got some time for discussion with the panel. Emma, would you mind unsharing your screen? That's great. So we now have got an opportunity to discuss things with the panel. So there's some really interesting themes coming through and offers of help from a lot of organisations, which I hope that the BMJ are noting down and will I hope get back in contact with people. But I'm just going to start off with questions as the questions come in. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll pick up as many of them as we can. Tamsin talked about changing culture. So can I start by asking panel members how to do that? Because I am aware that it is really difficult to change culture. Tamsin has made some very good starter suggestions, but are there other things that we could or should be doing to change this culture where it sounds as if sexual harassment and sexual misconduct is just brushed under the carpet still? So any panel members like to comment on how we might change the culture? Hina, and then Emma.
Hi there. Yes, I think it's a really important point that Tamsin raised, and I think that I think that one of the real problems is that quite often, as I mentioned before, it is an embedded culture of acceptance of sexual violence and sexual harassment that leads to organizations that have the biggest problems. I have often found that there tends to be some organizations that are resistant to any kind of change at all, but it tends often when there is an incident or a change of personnel where someone recognizes the problem, then culture change is possible. It is difficult and it's slow, but I think it does start with raising the awareness, creating an openness about sharing issues. And a lot of this will happen because when people have policies that are properly crafted, that look at all sorts of situations, and those policies are properly communicated, people then should be made aware of what the problems are, how they manifest, because they're not always really obvious. They can be quite subtle and corrosive. And also when to recognize them, because quite often people in an environment may see things going on, but they don't really know what to do about it or whether it really constitutes sexual harassment. And then, of course, the steps that need to be taken to take it forward. So I don't think it's a multifaceted approach that is needed to change culture, and I imagine it would take a fair bit of time. But in my own experience over a number of years, I have seen organizations change their culture, and it's often driven by a claim they may have had to defend and they realize the magnitude of the problem, or some individual that is very proactive and prepared to take the steps and challenge those that don't want change, to move things on.
So a challenge to the NHS employees and the BMA to keep talking about this in order to change the culture. Emma, you also had a point to make there. Your QI approach fits very well with what we do in the NHS. Sounds like it's working.
Yes, we love QI, especially in mental health. We love it. But I agree with Hina in that, yeah, it takes. The thing is with us, it wasn't because we were trying to defend ourselves against something. It's just that we were listening to our staff, and in all conscience, we could not. How can we empower our staff to be compassionate, care for patients, patient safety, when they don't feel safe themselves? And we've been doing this work for. I mean, it's such hardcore work, but at the same time, it's great work when it works. We've been doing this since 2016, and I can say, hand on heart, we have a really open, transparent culture here around sexual safety. It's taken us a long time to get there, and it's taken us a number of QIs, but I think it's just having a couple of people coming together that are enlightened, compassionate, care for staff, care for patients, and can listen and hear really difficult conversations.
Can I ask you whether because it sounds as if the problem in your trust originally was related to patients. Do you have problems related to staff as the perpetrators as well?
Of course, yeah. And if anything, I'd say patient incidents are decreasing, and staff is on the increase.
So should that be treated differently?
Well, I think if you're using a methodology, I think possibly not, because it's still the same issue about having that uncomfortable conversation, and it's still to do with the fact that because we personally work in a very restrictive, medium secure environment, which is a step down from, say, Broadmoor Hospital, we have different priorities in that safety is the priority, safety of patients and staff. So we need to sort of be really quite clear and transparent about actually, if this behaviour is going on, then there are going to be consequences. It is going to affect how you potentially work here, because patient safety is at the centre of all of this for us. So I think you have to adapt, and sometimes you have to do it on a case basis, but I think that culture change, it's an ongoing thing. It's never static. It's something that you're always going to have to develop.
And so for both patients and also for staff. Thank you. I think somebody else had their hand up. Who was it?
I just have one tiny comment.
Yeah, go on.
Just that one of the big problems that I see frequently is the fact that there is a fear of those in authority, the ones that are often the perpetrators of sexual violence or sexual harassment. Are often quite powerful, quite influential. And the big fear is that if anything is raised, then in fact the damage will only be to the person's career who's raised the issue. And I see that an awful lot. I think something really needs to be done to actually address that. I've seen situations where someone has tackled that issue and decided to bring maybe a founder or a very senior individual to account for their actions, and it takes an enormous amount of courage. I think so. Something needs to be done, very much so, to try and address that particular issue of power disparity.
So there's a comment in the chat that we should do what the military do and court-martial them. I quite like that idea, but there you go. I think Adele and then Tamsin wanted to come in. Should we start with you, Adele?
Thanks. I was just a quick comment to say that a theme that came up quite a lot in our research was talking to NHS staff was that actually there needs to be some kind of common language that everyone can agree so that we can call certain behaviours what they are. And sometimes people are quite shy about that. There's not a consistency around language. And I think if we're going to get to the bottom of it, we need to be really clear about what different categories of sexually unsafe behaviour are, and then exactly where to and what you should do in each case. So that's just a quick point from me.
So Adele, can I just come back to you on that, because there's something in the chat about national guidelines. Do you think that we should have national definitions and national guidelines, or should trusts be doing it individually? And then I would need to come to Tamsin.
Well, there are already national there are legal definitions for all these behaviours, and there are the Sexual Safety Collaborative recognises that in its report. So there are agreed terms. It's just I think that commonality is not used when at trust level. So when it comes to reporting incidents, they need to use the same language, and I think that's why if there was a comprehensive policy, one system, it would just be a lot clearer, make the problem a lot clearer.
So a policy that followed the guidelines and then implemented it.
And use the same language, consistent language, yeah.
Thank you. Tamsin.
I totally agree with that. I think this is really important thing for us to push forward on. The only comment I was going to say is that we've already started the culture change. Just to and that the first thing, in fact, as the Met Police have shown, is awareness. You know, we have been walking around. I mean, as Emma's saying, that they knew it was happening. There was anecdotal, and we've all known it was happening. Like Simon was saying, we all knew this was happening, but now it's out there. Now this report is there. Our survey, Chelsea's survey, it's all building up to being a lot of evidence that can no longer be ignored. That's the first step, but it's going to be a very long process. It's going to, it's not going to be a one-stop shop. There's going to be no one simple solution. It's lots of multiple things, but we've started.
So we have a diagnosis. We now need to move on to our management plan. Emma, your hand is up.
Sorry, just a quick one. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here because we've done a lot of this pre-work already. So please make the approach, or we can do some collaboration on this. Because we've done all that hard work here, and we're really happy to share.
Thank you. There's a lot of positivity about owning the problem and about sharing solutions and working together in the chat. So thank you very much from that. Can I just move on to another issue which I think Tamsin mentioned first, which is about anonymous reporting. There's something in the chat about the higher education sector having anonymous reporting for students. I have to say, in my experience, I found that difficult because the organisation where I tried to use anonymous reporting said, well, it doesn't give the person the right to reply. So what do the panel think about anonymous reporting of sexual misconduct? Does anyone want to either jump in or put their hand up? Oh, there's a hand up. Tamsin, can't say it. Anonymous reporting.
I can see that problem, but I think that that one idea would be that it would if anonymous reports were coming from one particular unit, then what it could lead to is an investigation of that unit that could be done by an external group, because as we've read in the chat, and as we know, sometimes the internal investigations are basically involved with either blaming the perpetrator or silencing them. And so, but it wouldn't be just taking the anonymous reports and then trying to act on them, but taking them as an indicator that this is the place that the focus should be on, and then going in and getting actual data from people. So obviously it would have to be handled very carefully, probably with very much with the help of IVDAs and and other experts. But the idea, I think, is not just to take an anonymous report and then act on it, but to use that to investigate further.
Thank you. So there's a difficult question here that I just want to raise people's awareness of. There's a question here that suggests that maybe international medical graduates who are in this situation are treated differently. What are people's comments about that? It says that there's gaslighting and people go on to protect their own pale, male, stale colleagues, and the GMC would not take kindly, I'm summarizing, to brown female technicians and brown female doctors in the same way as they would to others. Tricky question. Anybody want to handle that? Simon, I think you've got your hand up. I don't know whether it was about that, but
well, it was a bit of both. It was to support Tamsin's comment around anonymous reporting and to answer this. Anonymous reporting is the way forward. People who are afraid of anonymous reporting are fundamentally part of the problem. I mentored a trust who had multiple times tried to deal with a consultant who was a known sexual predator. And in their last meeting with him, he put his feet up on the chief exec's desk and said, either you've got a name at the top of that report or this is a waste of my time again, and left the office. There are systems in Australia, for example, where 3 anonymous reports or more about anyone instantly kick off a triaging process, but they mandate some form of investigation, and it allows for these things to be done while protecting the people who are experiencing these behaviors. People who say it's being used vindictively and all the rest, again, all the data shows that's just not a thing. The people are living in a dreamland. In terms of the comment around IMGs, again, best data supports that. This is a very intersectional problem. And again, because it's based around power and power structures, we know that the less power you have, for example, looking or sounding different to others, the more likely you are to experience this, and the less likely you are to be believed. The flip side being, if you are, for example, a straight white male, you are more likely to be treated very differently. Recently, the GMC had a case of a doctor who not only was investigated for sexual harassment and sexually inappropriate behaviors, he himself asked the GMC to be struck off, and the GMC didn't. So the fact is, we know that actually IMGs are treated very differently at every stage of this, from both experiencing these behaviors to being disbelieved when they try to raise concerns and the like.
Gosh, that's all quite depressing, isn't it? Can I ask another question from the chat, which is about whether we should have a different approach to trainees? One of the difficulties with rotating around is that your concern might be in a different trust from the trust you're currently working in. How should we approach that? Who wants to answer that from the panel? What do we do about, well, there are lots of reasons why we need to change the way trainees rotate, but don't get me started on that. Becky.
So this is something actually we've been discussing with NHS England, and they've particularly picked up on the fact that if a perpetrator causes an incident in one trust and then moves on a few weeks later, they continuously get away with it and it doesn't get communicated. So one of the things that they're looking at is how do we put that data together and how do we hold that data within a system? And that's something that's quite up for debate, because it then flows into the challenge of who's the employer for a trainee, which is always a bit of a big discussion, really. So there are some things being considered about that, but it's very, very early days. But certainly trainees as a whole, as victims, are a particularly vulnerable group because they're at the bottom of the ladder. It's quite often consultants and senior hospital team members and medics that perpetrate these behaviours, and unfortunately they tend to target those at the bottom of the ladder. And it's not necessarily just trainees, but also medical students quite frequently get targeted.
Yeah, now I have been aware of that, having run a medical school, and it's very, very difficult. There are people who are frequent flyers, and it's very difficult to know how to deal with them. So we definitely need to do something different. Another question that's come up, or at least a comment that's come up, is the word banter. So what's the difference between a bit of banter and sexual harassment? Who can help us on that? Simon.
I saw a load of hands.
And then Emma. Yeah.
I was going to say I saw a load of hands go up. Banter is a word that I hate. It is the UK version of locker room talk, or boys will be boys. It is possible to chat with friends and colleagues. It is possible to make jokes. But if your banter is of a sexual harassing or discriminatory nature, I don't care whether you think it's funny, it's a problem. And the issue we have is there's data even from preschools that if there is a power differential, you will laugh along and joke along with someone if they're more powerful than you, even if you're dying inside.
Thank you. Were there other hands up? Yes, Emma and Hina.
Just to say, with banter, that's a word that we that gets bandied around a lot in our inpatient services, and we say very simply with banter, if it crosses your personal boundary and it offends you, then that's it. That's banter. It's a really simple definition for us, and we're very clear on what potentially could happen when those boundaries are crossed. So, yeah, that's us in mental health.
Thank you. And then Hina.
Hi, yes, I mean, I'm very interested to hear all of these points, because it's heavily aligned to the kind of law that I do. And banter, I mean, it's established in case law and legal practice that sexual harassment can be anything. It can even be ostracizing someone, and banter is absolutely one of those categories. And banter, exactly as Emma said, it's all about whether or not you cross a boundary that is unacceptable to someone, because sexual harassment legally is unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which has an intimidating or creates an unhealthy working environment. So banter can be, and we were going to definitions. I know earlier mention was made about how do you define what sexual harassment is, and part of the problem is it is very, very broad. We all know what sexual violence is, but there's a lot. In fact, the majority, as we heard the statistics, was it 60%? It tends to be short of violence, but is equally damaging and equally problematic. And in my practice, I tend to see that more. And so all of it is really critical. And what people say really matters. I mean, even in the process of delivering training, I've heard people say things jovially that I consider personally to be crossing the mark. And so it can be quite difficult. Just a quick word on anonymity. Legally, in the working world, people often want to raise a complaint in an anonymous way. And I think it's really important that they are encouraged to do so. It doesn't mean that an employer cannot act or should not act, even if that individual who raises it anonymously says, I don't want anything done about it. That isn't really just down to the decision of the individual. If it is unacceptable behaviour, an employer has a duty to take some sort of action.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end now, but I've got, Tamsin, you wanted to come in, and then I've just got one final question to ask you all.
It was just a brief word on banter, just to sort of amplify what Athene Banks said in the comments, which is that the banter, particularly say in a surgical operating theatre, it is known that gives rise to a higher likelihood of worse sexual misconduct like assault. So as she says, you test out the waters. If the banter is accepted, then it seems to give rise to sort of a permissive environment for worse sexual misconduct. So we have to act on that. It's not just trivial.
Very interesting, thank you. So the last question, which I feel is a bit more controversial than maybe it was meant to be, is should we be training students and people in healthcare to know what to look for in order to report? So the reason why I feel uncomfortable is because I'm not sure we should be blaming the victims here. What do people think about training people to understand and recognize sexual harassment in order to encourage them to report it? Hina?
That is actually a fundamentally important thing to do. Training not just at the very top, but across the board. In fact, every single person. And the corporations that I go in and train, it is receptionist, junior temporary staff, all the way up to chief executive. And if it isn't that, then the system breaks down, because we need people to lead at the top, and we need everyone to be aware. And the important thing is, it's not just training so that they are aware themselves, but as I mentioned, so that they are able to identify the boundary lines, where to draw the line in the sand. The problem with the case law in this area is it is difficult, because there will be things that the courts have judged to not be sexual harassment, and things that they have, and sometimes it's hard to understand why they've come to that decision. But absolutely, if people are not trained, I think we have a big problem, and the training should be right across the board.
Thank you very much. So I think Chelsea also had her hand up. If you could be very quick, Chelsea, because I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, just to quickly say, I think it's really important that we start these conversations, including training in medical school, nursing school, etc., because these are the clinicians of the future. And we know that these behaviours occur even in medical school, even in university. So it's important to start learning these things early, and then hopefully that will give us a bottom-up approach, as well as doing this top-down approach as well, in trying to change the culture.
So that's a really good place on which to end. I'm sorry, Emma, we've come to the end of our time, but it just it remains for me to say thank you very much to everybody who's contributed. Thank you so much to the panelists, and also to the people who've posed questions and comments, and also, of course, for the BMJ for for raising awareness and for giving people the opportunity to talk about this in such an open and articulate way. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Now, we have some concerns that people may have felt triggered by some of the conversations that we've had, and we've suggested that if you either feel uncomfortable, or if you feel that you have more stories to share with any of the organisations that have been on the panel today, please do get in touch with us. So thank you very much to everybody for your contribution.
Thank you, Jane, for hosting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.